and I'll start the PowerPoints. All right, welcome everyone to this session on how to write a Creating Safer Space grant application. So to begin with, I will very quickly introduce the Creating Safer Space network. So our network aims to understand and support unarmed civilian protection and self-protection in the midst of violent conflict. We support research that explores how violence against civilians can be deterred or prevented by civilians without the use or threat of force. Our research focuses on conflicts in Colombia, South Sudan, Myanmar, and the Philippines, but research on other low and middle-income countries will also be supported. Our network is funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council of UK Research and Innovation through what is known as the Global Challenges Research Fund. We have recently launched a funding competition, and we very much hope to fund 15 to 20 research projects that meets the aims of the Creating Safer Space network. Our grants range from 20,000 to 100,000 British pounds for periods of 6 to 16 months. These projects must be led by organisations in the UK or in low and middle income countries. The application deadline is the 15th of April 2022, so I'm afraid that's coming up quite soon. And more information about grants is available on our website. So the aim of this session is not to provide information about our grants. We have previously held information sessions to introduce our grants, the eligibility criteria, what funding is provided, etc. And the recording of these sessions are already available on our website. I will send a link to these after the meeting if you're interested in finding out more about our grants. So the aim of this session is rather to provide some advice on how to write a grant application, and we suggest doing this in 8 steps. Now you might find that there are additional steps that are not described here, or that you would rather do these tasks in a different order, and that's perfectly fine. These 8 steps are simply to provide a rough guide to how the application process might work. So the first step is to confirm your eligibility. The second is to develop your project. The third is to write a rough draft. The fourth is to confirm your team and seek approvals. The fifth is to write a good draft. The sixth is to double check that you have demonstrated that you meet the assessment criteria. And the seventh is to seek feedback. The eighth is to revise, finalize, and submit the application. So as you can see, there's quite a lot to do as part of the grant application process. So if you haven't started yet, we really do recommend that you start as soon as possible. The first step is to confirm your eligibility. We recommend that you take a very close look at the Creating Safer Space call specifications and the frequently asked questions to ensure that you and your team are eligible for funding. If you do not meet the eligibility criteria, I'm afraid your application will be rejected, no matter how good it is. So please check this carefully. Think carefully about whether your idea fits with the aims of the Creating Safer Space network. All of our projects must enhance knowledge of unarmed civilian protection, or UCP, and one of our 3 research themes as described in the call specifications. If you're unfamiliar with UCP, it's a good idea to do some research at an early stage. To find out about what existing research is available on this topic, the Creating Safer Space research database is a very good place to start, but unfortunately it's currently down for technical issues, but we are very much hoping that these will be resolved as soon as possible. The second step is to start developing your project. Please do allow yourself plenty of time to prepare the grant application. Everything does tend to take longer than we think it will. Work with your co-investigators and project partners to develop a good idea and a project plan. This is especially important if you are working in a region of the world that you are unfamiliar with, then seeking local advice from local partners at an early stage would be very important. And please do contact your organizations at an early stage to find out about their administrative requirements and timescales. You can only submit the application on behalf of your organization, and you will be required to provide a letter of support from them. In the UK, you would normally need to contact your research office at least a month before the application deadline, and I know that many other countries have similar requirements. To complicate matters further, our application deadline on the 15th of April is just before Easter. So in many countries, you might find that your organizations aren't able to do very much in the week before Easter. So it's worth contacting them at an early stage to find out more. The third step is to write a rough draft. If you write a very rough draft on an early stage, you often notice any problems or challenges that may take longer to resolve. And it also helps to familiarize yourself with all the questions on the application form. So this slide lists all the different questions that you will be asked to answer. But I'm going to stop the PowerPoint for a moment, actually, so that we can actually have a look at the application form together. So this is the Creating Safer Space application form. The first part of the application form asks about the team members, the principal investigator, if you have any co-investigators involved in the project, and any project partners. It has some basic details and to provide a summary. And then the first main section, and probably the most important part of the application, is the case for support. The case for support asks you to first describe the aims of the project, the research questions or problems, the research contexts, and the project's contribution to knowledge. So this is asking you to describe how your project is original compared to the other research that is available on unarmed civilian protection. It asks you to describe the relevance of the project to the Creating Safer Space network and how it contributes to our understanding of unarmed civilian protection. It asks you to describe the research design and methods in quite a bit of detail, the role of each team member and project partner, how the project will be managed, the work plan, and the timescales. And we will be looking very carefully at the timescales because these are quite short projects, so we'll want to make sure that they are actually achievable within the timescales. It asks you to describe the project's planned outputs, how you will disseminate these outputs, and who might benefit from your research. And it asks you to describe how your project includes some elements of the arts and humanities. We are funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK, so I'm afraid all projects need to include some small element of the arts and humanities. You're welcome to structure the case for support in any way you wish, but it is often helpful to use these topics as the subject headings and to cover each in turn. That way you're much less likely to forget something important. This section is maximum 5,000 words long. That's quite long. It's the equivalent of about 6 or 7 pages of text. But it provides an indication of the level of detail we expect in your answer. In particular for the large grants, if you're substantially below this limit, you have probably not provided the level of detail that we require in your answer. But you can't exceed the word limit either, because then your application will be rejected. The next section asks you to describe ethics and safeguarding in the context of your project. So the ethical implications that might arise from the research and how these will be addressed, and how you will ensure that your research undergoes appropriate ethical review. There's then a section on security. What might be the security risks associated with the project in the context of the country that you are working in, and how you will ensure the physical safety of both your staff and your research participants. The next section is a data management plan. So for example, if you are undertaking interviews, then you would perhaps have audio recordings of your interviews, or you would perhaps transcribe your interviews, and this would be your research data. This section asks you to describe your project's approach to managing your research data, how you would ensure that it's safe and secure, and how you would be able to share that data. The next section asks you about official development assistance compliance. The Creating Safer Space Network is funded by the UK's foreign aid budget. And this means that all of our projects have to be compliant with official development assistance criteria. So please make sure that you answer each of these 4 questions so that we can make sure that that's eligible. The next section is also one that is required by our funder, and it asks about the implications of the project for gender equality. And then there's a number of supplementary documents, most notably a budget, letters of support from the organizations involved, and a CV. It is very important to answer each of these questions in detail. If you have not answered one of the questions, it is very likely that your application will be rejected. It probably won't even be sent to the funding panel. So it's very important to answer all of the questions on the application form. I'm going to share one more document. So this is the frequently asked questions. It's worth having a look at this when you are drafting your application form, when you're drafting your application, because part of it provides information about how to answer each question on the application form. So you can go to the case for support, for example, and to provide receive detailed information about how to answer each of the different questions. So looking at this at an early stage will help to ensure that you cover all the things that will be expected. I'll now take us back to the PowerPoint. And hand over to Berit for the next section.
Yeah, thanks, Katja. So we are now at step 4, confirm your team and seek approvals. So we have different roles within each project, and you need to make sure that you know who's doing what on your research team. So from lead organization with the principal investigator to co-investigators and project partners, and these are all described in the call specifications and in the frequently asked questions, if you want to look up what each of these is. So everybody should be happy with the role they're taking on and the responsibilities that means for the project, and the budget probably that is allocated to them. And we need letters of support from the lead organization, as Katja already said. So that is the organization where the principal investigator is based. If the co-investigators are from another organization, we would also have to have a letter of support from them, confirming that they're happy for their staff to participate in the project. And if they are project partners on the project, then we would also need a letter of support from each of those project partners. You also need CVs. Again, so the principal investigator and all co-investigators need to submit a CV, and you need to make sure that you have that in place when you submit the application. We would usually expect applications to be in English, but we have one exception, which is applications that are submitted in Spanish, which is possible. But if you're planning to submit in Spanish, we need to know by the 15th of March so that we can look for reviewers who will be able to read the Spanish and to review the Spanish applications. So this is our email address there, where we just ask you to contact us to confirm this. So step 5 is what we call write a good draft. So you usually start with a rough draft where you discuss the idea and try to fill a few things into each of the sections. But at some point, it's time to write a good draft. So to really start writing the narrative of usually what are usually characteristics of a good research proposal. The first is to write in plain English. So just make sure that everybody understands what you want to do in the project. Use short sentences, explain everything as clearly as possible, and assume that your proposal reviewer will not be an expert in the country or the specific case that you want to look at in your project. So everything should be well explained. The second point would be explain your contribution to knowledge. So these are research projects. Therefore, you need to show that it is important to answer your research question, and specifically in terms of contribution to knowledge, that no one has answered it before. You'll also need to show that you're aware of existing research and that your project fills an important gap in that knowledge. So this is why it's important to read a little bit around your topic that you're planning to work on, and to show how you're making a new contribution, maybe through new empirical data, maybe through a new question that hasn't been asked before, maybe through a new theoretical approach, but the idea is to contribute something that has not been done. The third point relates to timescales. You really need to think this through. As Katja says, so the overall Network Plus has an end date, which we cannot exceed, and the single projects cannot be more than 16 months. It will not be possible because of this overall project end date to give any extensions to projects. Therefore, the assessment panel will have a specific look at the achievability of your project within the time frame. Obviously, we hope for you to be ambitious with your research, but also be down or do a little less, but make sure that this links to the next point as well. Don't overpromise. A small and carefully planned project, which makes a small but potentially important contribution, is much better. So these 2 points are very much related. The last point, and this is really, really important, is about the budget. So there is a budget form. I don't know, Katja, are we going to show that as well? Maybe it might be useful to pull it up if you can after I've expanded a bit on this point. So obviously you have to submit the budget of your research. And I think different things you can put into that budget, but the budget is not just the simple numbers and how they add up, but the budget needs a justification. So our budget form has a part where it asks you to justify the costs you're putting in. The budget is an important indicator of how well you have planned your project. If you have an unrealistic budget, that can cast doubt on the strength of the rest of the proposal. Same if there are items missing from the budget. So for example, if you have specific methods in your research design and methods section that require, for example, that your researchers travel somewhere, but you don't have the travel costs in the budget, that would be a problem, because we need to see how you've thought the whole thing through and how everything has been budgeted for as well. Shall we show the budget form, Katja? Does that make sense? Do you want to say something about it?
Just a second, I'm just opening it up.
Yeah.
This is the Creating Safer Space budget form. You would need to use this specific form when you submit your application. It won't, I know that your organization might have other budget forms to use, but this is the one that you need to submit to us. The important part here is that there's a category that says item name and description. So you need to itemize, provide all the details about what you're purchasing. So if you're, for example, buying a flight to go to a conference, you need to provide full details about that flight. You then need to also show why you need that flight. So if you're going to a conference, you need to say in the justification section why that conference is very important for the project. And that's the case for all the different items in the budget. There are 3 sheets in the budget. So make sure that you use the correct one. There's more detail in the frequently asked questions about how to fill this in. So depending on what kind of organization you are, you use a different sheet. In this case, if you are based in a low and middle income country, you use the first sheet. And if you are based in the UK, you use the second sheet. Was there anything else that you thought we needed to mention about this, Berit?
No, I think that's fine, but just be aware that the justification section is for all the different items on this budget form. So even when it comes to salaries, and you put in a specific salary level, we would want to know what you're basing the salary level on. So is that a standard salary level in your organization or in your country, or is that a standard hourly pay for a specific task? So we would need to see how you justify the choices you've made also in terms of salaries for people, for example. Anything else, Katja?
And for salaries, also to justify the time commitment. Why does somebody need to work 50% on the project as opposed to 10%? So then you will need to justify that the workload is such that they need to work 50% on the project.
Yeah. So it's basically a narrative description of the figures you put into your budget. And the more detailed it can be, the better it is, because then the reviewers will have a very good basis to decide whether this is a realistic budget for your project.
I'll stop that and I'll go back to the presentation.
Excellent. Okay, so your proposal will be judged on the basis of assessment criteria, and these are the assessment criteria. So the reviewers who read the proposals will have these criteria in mind and will be asked to comment on them. So this is why it's very well, because that's what you're being judged on, importance. Does the project ask an important question? What is the potential contribution to knowledge? And is the question important to the Creating Safer Space network? Obviously, you can ask important questions, but they are not related to unanswered civilian protection. In that case, that wouldn't be a good proposal for our call. So make sure that you are actually addressing what this network is about. And also the question of how your wider research aims and question fit with the research methods. Are the methods appropriate to address? So this is all about research quality and importance. The next section, the next criteria is about people. So you've seen in this 5,000 word section, the case of support, that there is also a question around the description of the research team and their roles. So the reviewers will be asked whether the research team have the capacity to bring the project to completion. So we would want to see who is doing what in the project and why are they particularly suited to take on this particular task. The management of the project is a third important assessment criteria. This relates again to the question of whether the project plan and the timescales are appropriate and whether sufficient time and resources have been allocated to achieving each aspect of the project. The fourth point, the fourth criteria relates to value for money. Is the likely gain from this project worth the resources requested? Are the resources requested reasonable in the context of the project? So this is what we just talked about. This will be very much in the justification of resources, but overall the budget also has to kind of be in tune with the overall proposal. It has to work well together and has to give the impression that this is a good value for money project. And last but not least, there's the criteria of outputs, dissemination, and impact. So the question here is whether the outputs and outcomes of the project will be highly valued and widely exploited, both in the research community and in wider contexts where they can make a difference. So you've seen there was a question around research impact and beneficiaries, and you can think about this in different ways. Obviously, on the one hand, we have the research community, so academic outputs that help to further our knowledge on unarmed civilian protection, which could be an article, it could be a conference participation. But then there's also this other side of dissemination and impact, obviously, because we want to make an actual contribution to safer spaces for people in violent conflict. So the question here is, which beneficiaries will your project engage with, and how are you going to disseminate the findings and make an impact on them, which could be from local communities all the way up to international policymakers. So think about what your project and what kind of impact your project tries to make. A good step, if there's enough time for it, is step number 7, to seek feedback. In my own experience, the more people have read my applications, the better they actually are, because you get feedback from other people on things like the clarity of writing, have you explained everything, and so on. It's good to ask an unbiased external person with some knowledge of the research in related areas. For example, somebody who works in peace and conflict studies or security studies or similar areas to review your proposal. Also, trusted collaborators can provide very helpful feedback, but also ask someone who is less familiar with your work and with the specific research area, because they can have a different kind of focus on different things. So you might want to ask one specialist and one non-specialist, because they will see different gaps in your narrative. There are some kind of tried and tested techniques of what feedback people could do when they read your proposal. And here are 3 suggestions of what you might ask them to do. One would be a speed read test. So you ask people to give you their first impression from a 15-minute read, because quite often assessment panel members have a lot of proposals to read, and they will give much more time to proposals that make a very good impression already from the start, from the very first summary of the project, because they feel this is probably going to be a fundable proposal. So a speed read test is very good to assess whether your proposal draws enough attention of an assessment panel member to really read it in more detail later. There's the rejection test. You can ask people to give you 3 specific reasons why they think your proposal might be rejected, which basically highlights the weakest points in your proposal. I mean, hopefully, if it's a very good proposal already, there won't be any points to reject, but they may say, oh, the timeline doesn't look realistic, or I don't understand your research question, or whatever it is. And you then know that these are the specific points you need to work on. Or you could ask them to do a mock assessment test. So basically give them the creating safer space assessment criteria, those criteria we just talked about, and ask them to really provide a summary of the strong and weak points for each of these criteria. So the person who asks for feedback would basically act as a mock assessment panel member and read the proposal in the same way an assessment panel member would. So this probably takes the most time. You want to make sure who you ask to do this, that they have enough time to do this, but it's very useful to get this feedback. So once you have everything in place and you have had people to read through it, the last step is to revise, finalize, and submit the application. Just allow for, so if you are planning to ask for feedback, and we strongly recommend you do, allow for enough time to actually make those changes afterwards, right? So don't do it last minute, give people enough time to read, but also give yourself enough time to make those changes then. It's very important to check, once you've made changes, that everything is still consistent across the project. So for example, if you make changes to your research plan, you probably also need to revise the ethics statement, the data management plan, and the budget, this narrative around justification of budget too, because anything that changes in the research plan will have implications on one or the other of these other sections. And it's important that everything is consistent and fits together. Also make sure that you adhere to all word limits. So it always says maximum so and so many words, so maximum 5,000 words, maximum 500 words. It is a real maximum. So this is one of the eligibility criteria. If it says 5,000 words and you submit 10,000 words, your proposal will be eliminated from the process. But as Katja said before, the word limits are also some indications of the detail we want to see. So if it says 5,000 words, don't submit 3 sentences. Try to provide a substantial detail in that section. The application and all supplementary documents need to be submitted by the 15th of April. That is a deadline. After that, we will not accept the applications anymore. So everything that comes in from the 16th of April onwards will be rejected. And if you have any specific questions or any specific concerns that are kind of last minute, make sure to contact us before the 12th of April, because we may not be able to answer last minute queries, especially depending on how many of those come in. So any questions, please, before the 12th of April. So what happens after you've submitted your application? Now, there will be a review of your application. So your application will be assessed by 2 assessment panel members if you've submitted for a small grant, or by 3 assessment panel members if you've submitted for a large grant, who will be using the assessment criteria we just discussed. Each panel member will give the application a score between 1 and 6. So 1 means the application is unfundable, and 6 means it is exceptional. So you will be rated on this scale from 1 to 6. The assessment panel members will have significant relevant expertise in the wider area, in the wider topic area, but they may not be specialists in your research area. And this is important for how you write the proposal. Make sure it's understandable to somebody who's not a specialist in your very specific research area. So these are the reviews. The reviews then go to something called the assessment panel. So the reviewers meet in this assessment panel to discuss the suggested scores and to agree on the final grade. And based on this final grade, they will be able to rank the applications in order of funding priority from the best ones down to the least good ones. So this is based on the review scores, which will then be discussed. So it might happen that for a small grant, the 2 assessment panel members who have reviewed the proposal come up with the same score. Then it's easy. There's very little to discuss. Both think the proposal is exceptional, then it will probably get a 6 for exceptional. But it might also sometimes happen that one panel member is not convinced and gives it perhaps a 3. And the other one thinks it has much more merit and gives it a 5. In that case, both panel members will give their reasons for scoring it in one or the other way. And the whole panel will be able to discuss the proposal and agree on a final grade. So once this, oh, sorry, that was the last step. Once this final ranking is done, the list of proposals in funding priority goes to the final decision. And the final decision is made by the executive committee of the Creating Safer Space Network. The executive committee will not re-rank the proposals, so the ranking order will stay the same, but it will decide how many projects it can actually fund, depending on how much funding was requested for and how much funding there is, and whether to fund the most highly ranked proposals overall or the most highly ranked proposals for each core country to make sure that we have a balanced portfolio of projects. So just to give an example, if the 20 best projects are all from South Sudan, the panel can decide to just fund projects from South Sudan, but it might want to think about the wider network and the different regions we have in the network, and might want to decide to only fund 5 projects from South Sudan and then go down the list to find the best projects from other regions and fund those as well. So this will depend a bit on the outcome of that list. So Katja already said she's going to send you some links for more information. We have a website where we upload everything. So you will find all the application forms there, the frequently asked questions, the videos we are making of these sessions here as well. You can also, and we recommend that, subscribe to our newsletter, which you find a contact form for on the website, because that's where we send out more information about events like this or anything else that might be useful for you in writing your application. And of course, you can also contact us under our email address. I would say let's move on to the questions section then. I'll hand back to you, Katja.
Yeah, just a second. I'm gonna stop the